Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host Michael on a Wednesday, doing a second show for the day, joined by returning guest Dr. Mark Spencer. I had Dr. Spencer on a few years ago, and we were talking about Palimism and Thomism and his perspective on it based on an article that he had written. Certainly check out that interview. But now I have Dr. Spencer back on to discuss his most recent book here. I put a link to it also there in the description if you want to purchase a copy. It's called The Irreducibility of the Human Person, a Catholic Synthesis. Dr. Spencer, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Thank you. I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. It was an honor to interview you the first time and an honor to have you on again. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what all are you doing right now? Are you teaching somewhere? Tell us a little bit about what's going on with you.
Yeah, so I'm an associate professor of philosophy at the University of St. Thomas, which is in St. Paul, Minnesota. So I teach here. It's a broadly speaking Catholic school. And many of our students are seminarians. We have the St. John Vianney Seminary here, so I'm honored to teach them with their philosophy formation. And I write on a variety of issues. So nature of the human person, obviously. I also work on natural theology and aesthetics. And I try to bring together a wide range of traditions from across the Catholic philosophical and theological tradition.
And what's your doctorate specifically in?
Philosophy.
Yeah, philosophy. And you were with the University of St. Thomas there, I think, a few years ago back when I interviewed you, correct? You were still with them.
I've been here for 11 years.
11 years. Wow, that's awesome. So tell me a little bit about this book. What made you decide to write this? It's a pretty specific topic, the irreducibility of the human person. How did this come about?
Yeah, so ever since I learned that there was such a thing as philosophy, which was sometime in high school, I've been fascinated by questions about human nature and human personhood. The motivation is sort of very personal. I'm perplexed by myself. I'm perplexed by other people, and I want to understand people better. And so my research across my whole career has been focused on what are human persons. And the specific motivation for writing this book is I do a lot of research in a lot of different traditions, as I said. So phenomenology, scholasticism, the Greek patristic tradition. And what I find is I think that each of these different traditions captures something important about what it is to be a human person and something important about metaphysics in general. And what I wanted to do is take all those insights and try to systematize them, bring them together into one unified account of the human person. And then also, I just think defending the dignity of persons and defending the importance of persons is such a crucial task for the Christian philosopher nowadays. And so I wanted to, do some small part of promoting that.
So there would be some applicability here, I guess, maybe even for the pro-life movement. Would that be a stretch?
Yeah, okay. No, not be a stretch at all. Yeah.
And you're coming from the Thomistic perspective, correct?
So again, I draw on a lot of different traditions. A lot of my background is in Thomism. A lot of my background is also in phenomenology. And I've tried to draw on a range of other traditions as well. But there's a significantly Thomistic element to the book.
Strong Thomistic element. I remember you wrote a paper a while back dealing with issues related to Palimism, and you spoke of Reformed Thomism, which I found to be interesting because from what I recall, you were effectively arguing, from generally a Thomistic perspective, but willing to make some modifications to it when necessary.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's definitely the route I go in this book. So there's a sort of Thomistic base and then augmenting it with lots of other philosophical and theological approaches.
That's good. You're not just rigid, stuck in one box or anything. That's helpful. So tell me, let's just start with the very basics. What is a person?
Yeah.
How do we define this?
So a big part of the project of the book is trying to work towards an account of what it is to be a person. In short, a person is a being who is spiritual in nature. And by spiritual there, I mean capable of engaging in acts that are open to the whole of being. So for example, we have the intellectual power, which enables us to grasp and know any being whatsoever. We have the power of will, which enables us to intend any good whatsoever, anything that we can apprehend as a good. So a person is a being who has this sort of openness to the whole. Any being like that is going to be defined as a person. So that's going to include human beings. That's going to include angels. It's going to include the divine persons. Of course, these are radically different in a number of respects, but they share this characteristic of being open to the whole, of having this spiritual openness to all of being. That said, then persons are, as Thomas Aquinas says, that which is most perfect in all of nature. There's something about persons whereby we transcend, we are greater than everything else in creation, everything else in reality. And so what I want to capture is what's included in that greatness, what's included in that openness to reality.
You mentioned the divine persons there. So I'm kind of curious, when we use this definition of persons, are we speaking analogically here whenever we refer to the Trinity?
That's right. Yep. So I said, humans are persons, angels are persons, the divine persons are persons. And so we can give a sort of nominal definition of what it is to be a person, right? Person means a spiritually open being, right? And a substance of a spiritual nature. But that's going to, metaphysically speaking, belong to each of these different kinds of persons in distinct ways. The way in which you and I are persons is different than the way in which, say, St. Michael is a person, and that's different than the way in which Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are persons.
Yeah, that's helpful. Now, when we speak of then the irreducibility of the human person, talk about that. I mean, are there parts to a human person? How does irreducibility factor in here? Can you explain that?
Sure. So if we take a sort of our working assumption, which I do in the book, that persons are that which is most perfect in all of nature. What I think follows from that is that we cannot say of persons that they are nothing but something other than persons. And that's what it would be to say that a person is reducible, to say that they are nothing but something else. There are plenty of people who want to say the human person is nothing but a body, right? Or nothing but a collection of atoms, right? Nothing but a brain, nothing but a part of society. There are others who want to say the human person is nothing but a part of God or a manifestation of God. In each of these cases, what we're doing is we're taking something which presents itself as a whole, which is open to all of reality, and we're saying it is nothing but some other kind of thing. Right? That is, we're reducing it down to some other category of being. So to say that a person is irreducible is to say that we're not nothing but all of those other things, and then to try to chart out all the ways in which we are greater than, different from all of those non-personal things, matter, parts of society, and so forth.
I'm just curious with Boethius's definition of a person, an individual substance of a rational nature. Is that maybe an example of reducing someone to merely that, or was he not actually reducing them?
I think it depends on how we understand this definition. Right? So if we define the person as an individual substance of a rational nature, or we define the person, as I did just a minute ago, as an individual substance of spiritual nature, which amounts to the same sort of thing, we could understand that in two ways. So one, we could understand it as capturing in a conceptual formula the entirety of what it is to be a person. And if we did that, then I think we're being reductionistic. Right. The person includes everything within him or herself. I'm not merely a substance. I'm not merely an instance of a nature. I include all of my acts, all of my accidents, all of my other principles. Person names this whole thing that is here. So if we took that definition, or I argue in the book, any other definition as capturing the entirety of what it is to be a person, then yes, we'd be reducing persons. But on the other hand, if we take this to just sort of be a guide to perception, right? We're looking around the world and we want to know which are the persons. Well, find the things that have an intellectual or spiritual nature. Right? Those are the persons. So there we're not saying the definition captures everything about what it is to be a person. We're just saying it provides, say, some necessary and sufficient conditions for something being a person. Right? It allows us to pick out the persons from the non-persons. And if we take it in that sense, then I don't think it's reductionistic. Right? There's just a useful tool. And I think that's probably the sense in which Boethius and Aquinas and others meant it.
Yeah, because Aquinas repeats that, correct?
Correct, yeah. And plenty of other people in the scholastic tradition.
Mm-hmm. Now, you speak about in the book, early on in the book, hylomorphism and how it relates to real beings. Can you just introduce us to this concept, first of all, what hylomorphism is, and then again, how it relates to real beings as opposed to something else?
Yeah, good. First of all, just sort of in the context of the book, I work through in the book a number of different kinds of irreducibility. Right? There's lots of ways in which other philosophers try to reduce us, try to say we're nothing but something other than persons. And when I raise the theory known as hylomorphism, I'm especially worried about reducing human persons to being nothing but matter, nothing but bodies, or nothing but souls. So hylomorphism here is being raised as a contrast theory to various forms of materialism or physicalism and various forms of dualism or idealism, which would reduce us to being merely bodies or merely souls. So hylomorphism is the view. It comes from the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, and it's the view that we and other material substances are composed of form and matter. There's some stuff in us, some matter, which is potentially changing. It is able to change in various ways. And that matter has been actualized, made real, made complete, made perfect by a form. A form or actuality is a cause or principle that makes a material substance some definite kind of material substance. And so, on my view, following Thomas Aquinas, following Aristotle, human beings are composites of form and matter. Now, that's not to say we're nothing but composites.
Okay.
There's more to us than that. But we are composites of form and matter. And this helps preserve our irreducibility to being nothing but matter. Right? In addition to matter, we also have form. Right? We also have this actualizing principle, this principle that makes us real, unified, persisting human beings. It makes us remain human beings over time, and have all of our matter unified together, and give us these powers, these abilities we have over and above the mere abilities that our matter has. So we're not reducible to the matter. But then on the other hand, we're not nothing but minds or nothing but souls. Right? We're not nothing but our intellectual abilities or our volitional abilities. Rather, we also include matter. Right? We're also animals. Right? We're also these material things. So hylomorphism provides a language, a really helpful language, I think, for preserving this sort of irreducibility in each direction. Nothing but body or nothing but soul. And at least when it comes to the material world, I think it's the right sort of language, or a very helpful sort of language for describing real beings. So the contrast there is not real beings as opposed to some other kind of being. Rather, it's we want a vocabulary that allows us to describe the ways in which real beings show up for us. Right? Real beings show up as changing in some respects, staying the same in some respects, potentially becoming other kinds of things in certain respects, actually being the kind of thing that they are. And the language of hylomorphism, the language of form and matter, assists with that. It allows us to capture all of those features of real beings.
One of the things that you talk about in the introduction is your desire to tackle the problem of reductionism in this discussion. Can you talk about what exactly is this problem that you're tackling here?
Yeah, so I mean, I've talked about this a little bit with these sort of alternative theories of persons, theories that would say the human being is nothing but a body, right? Or nothing but a collection of particles. So these are various kinds of reductionism. And I'm concerned about these for a couple of reasons. One, I think that if we adopt one of these theories, it says that we're nothing but something other than a whole person. The theories we take on sort of guide our perception, right? We see according to our beliefs. And so if we take on a reductionistic theory, it's going to lead us to see other persons as less than they actually are. Our perception of the world is going to be truncated in some way.
What are some examples of how that might play out, in practice?
Sure. So, consider the materialist scientist who thinks that the human being is nothing other than a collection of body parts.
Right.
They're very quickly going to treat human beings as nothing but collections of body parts, right? So, love is nothing but like secretion of dopamine and oxytocin in the nervous system. That's all that it is. And all the rich experience of love or knowledge or other sorts of personal acts are going to be treated as nothing but manipulable features of the nervous system. So it has this sort of practical consequence, which leads into my other concern about reductionism, which is an ethical concern. Once we start to see persons as nothing but matter or collections of body parts or things like this, it's going to lead to changes in how we treat persons, right? A lot of the sort of dehumanizing practices that human beings engage in, right? You mentioned, pro-life issues, abortion, for example, are a result of seeing persons as less than full persons. And so what I'm trying to do in this book is sort of paint a portrait of what would the person look like if we were to treat the person as non-reductionistically as possible. And then if we can internalize that vision, then that's going to lead us to see persons in their fullness. And hopefully that's going to help us better treat persons as full persons.
Now, you gave there an example with materialists. What about somebody who doesn't hold to a materialist perspective, but does still reduce a person to, let's say, Boethius's definition?
Sure.
Is there, are there potential dangers here even with that?
I think so. Yeah. So, I mean, another concern that I have here is Catholic philosophers and theologians throughout history, by and large, have sought to defend the dignity of persons. And try to attend to persons in their fullness. And yet, human beings tend to have sort of reductionistic tendencies. So we tend to try to explain persons in terms of something else. And there's a danger with something like the Boethian definition, or with Aristotelian Thomistic hylomorphism, or with pretty much any other theory that attempts to explain persons entirely in terms of some finite, limited set of concepts. And the one danger here, I think there's a couple dangers, but one danger is it leads to a stance in which we treat persons, both ourselves and others, as something that we have a sort of mastery over, where what it is to be a person is fully captured in my concepts. And so I come to see other persons, and I come to see myself as something that I've fully got a handle on, fully got a grasp on. And what does this leave out? This leaves out things like freedom, the ability to determine the course of our own lives. It leaves out the possibility of unexpected and new experiences of persons. It leaves out the possibility of unexpected and new acts that persons can perform. For example, acts that we perform under the influence of grace. So the sort of openness of the person to the new, openness of the person to the whole of being, even things that we have never grasped or been able to grasp previously. There's a danger that is going to be left out or overlooked if we take ourselves to have fully captured what it is to be a person in some set of concepts. And so while I think theories like hylomorphism, definitions like the Boethian definition are true so far as they go, they fail to fully capture all that it is to be a person. And so what I'm looking for in this book is an account that would allow us to not capture all that it is to be a person in concepts, but perceive all that it is to be a person in some way, in a sort of non-mastering, non-controlling sort of way.
Yeah, that's fair. Now, there's another thing that I was curious about, and that is Thomism, Scotism, and the phenomenological perspective and how they compare with each other in reference to anthropology. This is another thing that you touch on in the book. Can you speak to this? What are some differences here in their perception or explanation of anthropology?
Sure. So yeah, I'm drawing heavily on the scholastic tradition on the one hand, so approaches like Thomism, Scotism, things like that, and on the other hand, I'm drawing heavily on the phenomenological tradition, which is a 20th and 21st century philosophical movement that seeks to explore the structure of human experience from the first person point of view. That is, from the point of view of the I, the self. How do I experience the world? How does the world show up for me? And you sort of get different emphases in these two approaches. So on the phenomenological approach, what's emphasized is my personal experience of myself, my personal experience of the world. Right? It's a method for describing how things appear from my point of view. And so there's going to be a heavy emphasis there on subjective experience, interior experience. What's going to be of significance for the person, perhaps of greatest significance, is the fact that I experience myself as a subjectivity. Right? I experience myself as something self-aware, self-conscious, self-determining. So here we have this method that I think captures really well how the person is not reducible to sort of purely objectively describable categories. On the other hand, the scholastic approach takes a causal approach. We look at how do we show up, and then we try to explain that in terms of underlying causes. Right? What must I be fundamentally in order to show up in some way? Right? So I appear, like all material things do, I appear as something changing over time and also staying the same over time. Well, we explain that in terms of those principles of form and matter.
Right.
So the scholastic approach captures really well how the way in which we appear in experience is rooted in these underlying causes, these underlying real things. And the phenomenological approach captures well the way in which I experience myself and the way in which I experience the world. So different emphases. I try to argue in the book that the two are complementary to one another. Right? We need an account of experience. We need an account of the way in which we appear to sort of provide the starting point for thinking about persons. But then we need to reason about that causally. Right? We need to say, okay, here's how phenomenology has rigorously described the way in which persons show up in experience. Now, what must we be sort of at a more fundamental level in order to appear that way? Right? And so then we reason back to these underlying causes, which scholasticism, Thomism, Scotism, provide us with a helpful language to describe. And then all of that needs to be put together into a unified account of the person, where we sort of don't lose sight of either side there.
Now, there are several chapters that you devote to concepts such as the intellect, will, and soul. These are terms that we often throw out, in common usage and, in theological discussions. But I fear that in many instances, we're probably not able to really define them very well. Can you maybe define those terms for us, intellect, will, and soul, and then how do they relate to this discussion of the human person?
Sure. So I talked earlier about how, on my account at least, a person is a being with spiritual powers, where spiritual powers are these powers that are open to the whole of reality. Intellect and will name two of those abilities.
Okay.
So we have the ability to take in information, to come to know not just the particular things in our environment that we sense, not just the things around us that are of relevance to us as biological organisms, but we're capable of grasping potentially anything whatsoever. Right? We have this openness to grasping and conceptualizing and articulating, expressing in language, potentially anything whatsoever. And we see the possibility of doing this in the experience of, say, doing metaphysics, right? In which we think about what is it to be a being? Right? What is it to be an existing thing in general? Not this or that kind of existing thing, but just what is it to be an existing thing? And so there we're able to formulate theories and ask questions about anything whatsoever. Right? So intellect names that power, that ability we have to be open to the whole in such a way that we can come to know something about anything and everything. So it's a power of knowledge. But then on the basis of that knowledge, we are able to love, to be moved by, and to move ourselves towards anything that we can grasp as a good, anything that we can grasp as something desirable or important in some way. So will names this ability to determine ourselves, move ourselves towards any being, any good whatsoever, on the basis of what we have intellectually grasped. So we come to know the world, and then we move ourselves towards the world in a motion of love, of affinity towards some being. So that's the way in which I understand intellect. So the inward motion of reality coming to me, and then my motion of determining myself to move back out towards reality in a rationally guided way. Oh, and you asked about soul too. Yeah. So, going back to that theory of hylomorphism that I'm drawing from Aristotle and Aquinas and folks like this, soul on this view is just a sort of technical term for our form. Right? What is it that structures our matter, that gives unity and persistence and powers to our matter? Well, we call that soul. But in the human being, the soul is something that entirely transcends, is entirely irreducible to the matter. And that's because I have those abilities that we just talked about, these spiritual powers, these powers of being open to all of being. So I've got these abilities which enable me to perform acts that go beyond all the limitations of matter. Right? Matter localizes things, it particularizes things. Right? Because I have this matter, right? I'm located here, right, in this chair, in my office, right? Not where you are. So matter localizes and particularizes, and all of the powers that are located in matter, like my seeing and my imagining and my hearing and my passions and so forth, all of these abilities are also localized. Right? I only have sensory access to the things in front of me, right? The things that are around me. By contrast, those powers we were just talking about, intellect and will, are totally open to all of reality. They're not localized. They're not limited here. My thought can range out across all of space-time and grasp anything whatsoever. And so the human form, the human actuality, that which makes this a human being, which we call the soul or the form, is not reducible to just being the unity of this matter. Right? Not just reducible to just being the actuality of this matter, the reality of this body. It goes beyond the body. And so for this reason, we can conclude that the soul is something more, something over and above the body, not dependent upon the body for its action, at least not for all of its actions, or for its existence.
How is then the soul different than the spirit? What's the difference there?
Yeah, good. So we can sort of distinguish two aspects of the soul on this account. So the soul names the form of this body, right? That which structures and unifies and makes this an actual body, a human body, and makes it persist as a body over time. So that's one aspect, the sort of form aspect of the soul. On the other hand, my soul, as I just argued, has these powers, like intellect and will and other spiritual powers that go beyond the body. right, which give me this total openness to the whole of reality. And on the way I cash these terms out, spirit names that aspect of the soul. So they're not exactly, they're not two separable things. They are, as it were, sort of two sets of functions which which the soul performs, forming the body, performing spiritual acts.
Yeah, so you're not saying that man is kind of this tripartite composition, but is more bipartite. But then we can distinguish between one of those parts, right? Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So I want to sort of give each of those views their due. Like I think the bipartite view captures something really fundamental and important about human persons, because I think this hylomorphic language is helpful for capturing things about the persons. But I also think the tripartite language captures something important. There is a distinction between these two different functions. Right? My soul's body-forming functions are not the same as its spiritual activity functions.
Yeah.
So there is a distinction there, but it's not, I think, a distinction of two different things. Right?
It's not a division.
That's right. Yeah.
No.
Yeah, it's a distinction of activities or powers.
That's helpful. Now, you also spoke about the will being a movement towards, our intellect, I think is the way you put it. And I assume here, what you're saying by that is what our intellect perceives as a good. Does that then mean that we always choose the good or a good? We can never choose a non-good, or is there such thing as a non-good? Can you help me out there?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that when we will, right, say when we choose, when we intend some good, when we determine ourselves to move towards some good, we always do so on the basis of reasons. Right? I've got some thoughts in my mind. Right? I've got some ways in which I've conceived of the things around me as good, as desirable, as worth pursuing. But I don't think that that's determinative of what I choose. Right. So it frequently happens that, I come into a situation and I'm aware, this course of action is the best course of action. It's good. And this other course of action is sinful. Like I shouldn't do it. But I apprehend it as a good in a certain sense. That is, as something desirable in a certain sense. It's going to give me some pleasure. It's going to give me a feeling of power or whatever. And so I choose that. Right. So I know full well this is wrong. This other thing is the good. So the reasons there are not determinative of what I choose. Right. I determine what I choose. The reasons provide me with options. Now, I do think that I cannot move myself towards something unless I conceive it as having some sort of importance, some sort of value, some sort of worthwhileness. If I conceive of some course of action as totally unimportant, that is totally being devoid of having any sort of worthwhileness for me, I can't choose that. So long as I can conceive of it as being worthwhile in some sense, even just in the sense that it's going to be, momentarily, subjectively satisfying, then it becomes a live option for me. But I really want to defend the idea that our willing, our freedom, is not reducible to our reasons. It's guided by reasons, but it's ultimately determined just purely by me. I have this power to select among options. Guided by, constrained by reasons, but not determined by reasons.
And if it's not determined by reasons, does that make it somehow arbitrary? I mean, maybe I'm not following fully well here, but
no. Yeah. So here's where I think phenomenology, an analysis of experience, can be helpful. Right? Think about when you make a choice. You've got options available to you.
Yeah.
And those options are grasped by reason.
Yeah.
And you select among those options. That is, you experience yourself performing this act. Here are my options, and I choose that rather than that. And in the experience of choice, in the experience of self-determination, it's a fully intelligible choice. It's a fully intelligible act. It's not in any way the same experience as like flipping a coin and just
Yeah.
arbitrarily going with one or the other. So what I want to capture here is this idea that there are determined events where you got a cause, it just automatically leads to the effect. There are arbitrary or chance events in which, given all of the causes, there's maybe some probability of a particular effect coming about, but there's no necessary connection between the two. And then there's a third category. There's free or self-determined events, where the selection of some effect is, it's not arbitrary, it's not random, it's not a matter of chance, but it's also not determined by prior causes other than my selecting. From the experiential point of view, is fully intelligible and it doesn't feel arbitrary. There's no experience of arbitrariness there. So I guess part of my worry about the way that a lot of philosophers have treated freedom, including in the Catholic tradition, is they want to sort of put it into one of those two boxes. Either it's determined by its causes, like by reasons, or it's purely arbitrary. And I'm arguing, no, there's a middle course, which captures the experience of freedom, these self-determining acts.
Yeah, that's fair. Now, you also talk about in the book social acts, and you discuss how they relate to personhood. Can you explain to us what you mean by social acts?
Yeah, so this is a term I get from the phenomenological philosopher Dietrich von Hildebrand. And von Hildebrand is he's working in that phenomenological tradition, but he's also trying to metaphysically account for our experience of ourselves and our experience of acts. And so he's looking for kinds of acts that we perform that have some relation to intellect and will, but are distinct from intellectual acts and willed act in some way. So he wants to argue there are other kinds of spiritual acts that we perform in addition to intellectual acts and willed acts. And social acts are acts that essentially take another person as their object.
Right.
So this is acts like promising someone to do something, commanding someone to do something, co-acting with another person. Like if you and I engage in an act of joint attention, like we watch a movie together, and I experience myself watching the movie along with you, and you experience watching along with me, which is a very different experience than watching it by yourself. So it's these acts in which it essentially requires two persons, and their acts have to join together in some way.
I think you mentioned forgiving in the book is another example. Yeah. Am I recalling correctly?
That's right. Yeah. Forgiving, promising, things like this. If I wrong you and you want to forgive me, it requires some sort of act on my part as well. Right? Sort of, you can't fully forgive me if I don't repent.
Right.
So there's that joining together of two acts. Like, you can will to forgive all you want.
Sure.
The event of forgiveness has not taken place unless I repent. And likewise, if I want to make a promise to you, it requires you to accept the promise. I can will to promise if I want to, but if you refuse to accept the promise sort of hasn't fully happened. Okay. So yeah, these social acts are acts that essentially involve multiple persons and essentially take other persons as their objects.
So this is one of the reasons why I guess we can't reduce someone to an intellect and will. We have to be able to say that there's also social acts. Does that then mean that personhood by nature requires other persons to, I'm not a person unless there is another?
That's right. Yeah. So relationality on my account is essential to what it is to be a person. We see this, all the way up the scale of personhood, right? All the way up to the Trinity. Right? Relationality is constitutive of the Trinitarian persons. Right? What does each of them have other than the divine nature? Well, it's their relations to the other persons. And I think the same thing is true of us. We essentially come to be in a state of dependence upon the divine persons. So central, fundamental to human personhood is a relation to the divine persons. We also come into existence in a state of dependence upon other human persons, our parents, and by extension then our other ancestors and the culture into which we're born. So relationality to other persons is central to personhood. We can't be reduced to being purely individual substances. We are individual substances, I'm not saying that. But in addition, we are relations to other persons. This is perhaps another danger of that Boethian definition.
And if we were to reduce ourselves to just that, would that then kind of end up assuming a Sabellian or, modalistic view of the Trinity or something like that? I mean, would it eventually kind of maybe lead to that?
I think so. And I mean, this is a worry that gets raised throughout the scholastic tradition about the Boethian definition as applied to the Trinitarian persons. Right? There's a worry that it's going to get understood as, in that sort of modalist way, or on the other hand, in a tritheist kind of way, right, where we have sort of completely distinct substances. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done to explain the exact sense in which that Boethian definition needs to be understood. And I think that's the sort of nuances there are captured well by a view of personhood on which we are both fundamentally substances and relations.
Now, one thing that I've heard brought up multiple times, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it based on your research, and that is, can we still say that one is still a person whenever they die and they're separated from their body? I've heard some people basically say no. So if your answer is no, tell us why. If your answer is yes, tell us why.
Sure. Yeah. So let me just sort of lay this out in terms of that, a little more about that debate. So this is a major debate right now, especially among Thomistic philosophers. And so you've got sort of two camps. On the one hand, there's the view that says the human person is essentially and necessarily a union of soul and matter. That is, you need both in order to exist, in order for this person to exist. So this view is sometimes called corruptionism, from the idea that when we die, we corrupt, we go out of existence. My soul continues to exist on that view, but that soul is not me. Rather, it's merely a part of me. It's sort of preserving my identity until the resurrection. At the resurrection, when the soul gets matter back, then I come back into existence. And so this view is really trying to hold on to this idea that we are essentially animals. We're essentially material things. The other view is known as survivalism, the idea that the person survives. And on that view, which is the view I endorse, what I essentially am, or maybe put more carefully, what is needed for me to continue existing are those spiritual powers.
Okay.
And the thing to which those spiritual powers belong, the soul. Which is not to say I'm nothing but a soul, right? I'm the soul and the acts and the accidents and everything else that belongs to it. I'm that whole thing. But this is to say, I do not need matter, strictly speaking, in order to exist. Nevertheless, I need matter in order to be complete, in order to have all that is supposed to belong to a human person. I use a sort of analogy of an amputation. Right? Human beings ought to have arms and legs. It belongs to human nature to have arms and legs. But if I get my arms and legs amputated, or if I lose them in an accident, I still continue to exist. It's still me. And so on my view, which is a version of that survivalist view, we should think about death as a really radical amputation. Your whole body gets amputated. So you're in a debilitated state. You are missing a lot of things you ought to have and that you need for full human flourishing, which is why the resurrection is such good news, that you're going to get those things back eventually. And but we should still say, I think, that so long as you have those conscious spiritual powers, you are preserved. That's the core to personhood, is those spiritual powers. Even though all the other stuff, the bodily powers, are really important.
Is there a book, by the way, that addresses the survivalist versus corruptionist debate and kind of has some back and forth between them, like the Counterpoint series? Is there anything like that?
Uh, Not that I know of. There have been sort of isolated instances of this. So the journal Questiones Disputate out of Franciscan University of Steubenville had a little back and forth thing a while back. And then there's things in various books and articles. But to my knowledge, there isn't like a single volume that's collected all of this stuff together, which is there ought to be. It's a good idea.
It's waiting to be written.
So I provide a sort of survey of the literature in this book, but it's not the main focus of the book.
Yeah, right. So let me throw you a curveball here and get really flippant and ask you, okay, so, and this is, by the way, in light of my recent interview with Dr. Paul Thigpen, are aliens persons?
Like, could there be alien persons?
If there were aliens, would they be persons?
I think it's possible. That is, we would need to try to figure out, can they perform genuine spiritual acts? Intellect, will, social acts, other sorts of acts that are open to the whole of being. Now that might be difficult to figure out, especially if they have like radically different biology from us, or engage in strange acts that we don't recognize. I think a lot of people are sort of confused about how easy this is. We see this with some of the talk about like artificial intelligence. People are very quick to ascribe spiritual acts to artificially intelligent systems, neural nets and things, which I think is sort of evidence that it is easy to simulate spiritual acts. And also, it's possible for a very sophisticated sensory creature, a creature who is able to consciously grasp particular things in their environment. It's possible for them to sort of approximate spiritual acts. We see this in some of the research into dolphins and chimpanzees and things like that. And Thomas Aquinas sort of predicts that this will be the case. So he's got this account of the hierarchy of being, and he says, as you get to sort of the top of a group of creatures, they're going to more and more approximate the things above them. So the most sophisticated plants are going to start to look like animals. And the most sophisticated animals are going to start to look like human beings. He talks about how dogs and horses and things have a character that sort of looks like virtues. They kind of exhibit prudence or courage, start to approximate things above them. And so it might be difficult to tell whether an alien is a person with genuine intellectual and volitional acts, or if they're just a very highly developed sensory creature who can process, things about particulars in their environment really, really well, but they don't really grasp the natures of things, grasp beings themselves. I don't know.
That's very helpful. And by the way, I'm glad you mentioned there the chimpanzees, because that's kind of where I was going to go next, because it seems like there are some things that, as you mentioned there, approximate spiritual acts. Wasn't it Mortimer Adler, I think, in one of his books, where I think it's the last chapter of one of his books, he discusses this issue in relation to animals. And he says what really distinguishes us from animals is this ability to do these spiritual acts, where we can look at particular things and kind of extract a universal form from them, I think is how he put it. And so you would say, animals can't do that, but there are some things that they can do that seems to approximate that.
That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, animals, on the Thomistic view, at least, and I mean, I think based on our best like animal behavior research now, animals can, especially the higher animals, can grasp particulars in their environment really well. They can categorize them. They can notice resemblances among them in a quite sophisticated way. They can communicate those resemblances, but none of that is to grasp the essence of a thing. What human beings can do is we can ask, what is this? What is this thing fundamentally? Not just how is this going to help me? How can I, act towards this thing in a way that's going to make my life easier or lead more towards my flourishing? But we can ask, what is this fundamentally? That's the question that sort of marks out persons. The ability to abstract from the particular is also the ability to abstract from relation to my biological needs and my particular bodily life. So yeah, I think animals can think, process, cognitively process in a very sophisticated, very detailed way, and they can communicate in very complex ways. But what they don't do is inquire into the fundamental natures of things. They don't do philosophy, they don't do theology, they don't do science.
Yeah.
They don't produce genuine artworks.
Yeah. But when you say they see similarities, isn't that somewhat perceiving the universal form?
I don't think so exactly, though I think it's going to maybe depend upon what we mean by universal form. So when I hear someone like Adler or Aquinas or someone like this talking about universal form, what I think they're getting at is grasping the fundamental intelligibility of things. They're not just saying human beings can come up with a term that covers many things. Underlying our ability to come up with a term that covers many things, right, like dog, which applies to all the dogs, is our ability to think about what it is to be a dog, to grasp what a dog fundamentally is, which is very different than, noting that all of these things have the same shape and we'll come up with a term that's going to apply to all of those.
Right.
It seems that plenty of animals can do that. They can detect patterns and then communicate those patterns in some way. But this would be an act on Aquinas's view of what he calls the internal senses, right? What he calls the common sense and the cogitative power, which are these abilities to grasp patterns in things.
That's very helpful. Everybody, I encourage y'all to get a copy of The Irreducibility of the Human Person, a Catholic Synthesis by Dr. Mark Spencer. Any concluding comments or a plug that you want to put in for anything in addition to the book? Anything else?
No, not for now. I mean, I've got other projects I'm working on, but they haven't come to fruition quite yet. But yeah, thank you for promoting the book. And yeah, I hope people check it out.
Can we get a sneak peek on what it's going to be about, or you can't talk about that yet?
Yeah, no, I can't. I'm working on a little book right now for Cambridge University Press. It's called Catholicism and the Problem of God, and it's a survey of sort of the major problems, philosophical problems having to do with God that have arisen over the course of the Catholic tradition and the way in which Catholicism has solved those problems or tried to solve those problems. And then I'm in the very early stages of a book on beauty. I should mention that beauty is a sort of central theme in the Irreducibility of the Human Person book. I think that ultimately the best language we have for expressing the irreducibility of persons is the language of beauty. And so I get into that a bit in this book, but I'm in the very early stages of working on a book exploring different strands of the Catholic tradition and other traditions as well on beauty and thinking about what does the experience of beauty reveal about the fundamental structure of reality and especially about God.
Yeah, I think that's one of the proofs for God, if I'm not mistaken, by Bonaventure, right?
Bonaventure appeals to some aesthetic experiences and others as well in the tradition.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about your book and breaking down some very, very complex stuff into ways that we can all understand. So I really appreciate it, Dr. Spencer.
Well, thank you for having me on. I enjoyed it.
Everybody hit that like button and the subscribe button and go purchase a copy of the book. It's there in the show notes, a link to it on Amazon. All right, we'll see you later. God bless. Oh, wait, before you go, I would really appreciate it if you would consider supporting this channel. This is my primary means to provide for my family, and it also helps me to produce content like this video. If you would like to support me, become a patron by visiting patreon.com/Reason and Theology. You'll also get access to extra exclusive content when you become a patron. Lastly, hit that like button and the subscribe button, and be sure to leave a comment down below. God bless.